Hello Resident Evil fans! By now we should have all played the remakes of both Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 produced by Capcom. Both remakes bring the late 90s classics into the modern day era with the over-the-shoulder controls, graphical updates and most importantly, for the purpose of this video, a storyline overhaul. Now, before we start, this video is designed to be extremely pedantic over specific storyline and lore points. It is not a criticism of the actual gameplay, its mechanics, and our overall review of both games. Indeed, we at the Resident Evil podcast thoroughly enjoy both remakes for different reasons. What we're looking at today is whether these two remakes in particular have created a new alternative Raccoon City storyline, or is it, as what has been suggested, part of an existing 20+ year mythology? It is therefore pertinent to ask, as he was introduced into the remake only, is Dr. Bard canon? A quick briefing of Resident Evil's storyline for the past 20 years has shown a remarkably consistent narrative despite many writers, producers and directors all being involved in a host of games. In terms of the chronology of events, we start with Resident Evil 0, which lays down the events for the T-virus leak in the mansion as depicted in Resident Evil. This, along with a whole host of other events, triggered the Raccoon City incident, which was covered in remarkable detail in Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 3 and both Resident Evil Outbreak games. If you want to see how complex and intriguing that storyline is, we would point you in the direction of Resident Evil podcast staff member Batman and his excellent mythology on our website. A link will be in the description below. Here, the Batman has meticulously codified all the in-game information, files, events and additional information from supplemental material to accurately transcribe the events from July 1998 up until Raccoon City's bombing in the early hours of the 1st of October 1998. So, when completing this, how was it decided what was canon and what wasn't? Indeed, all Resident Evil games present players with a certain degree of choice over their actions, whether that be quite major decisions, such as who you play as during the mansion incident, to minor decisions such as who manually deactivates the brakes of the Ecliptic Express in Resident Evil 0, for example. Indeed, there are multiple paths and routes in Resident Evil 2 with the zapping system, and Resident Evil 3 with options in life selection and ending outcomes. It has often been said that there is never a true canon path shown in any Resident Evil game, and to an extent this is true. Clearly no player is canonically ever bitten by a zombie, as they all ultimately survive free of T-virus infection. A lot of the time, to establish any indication of the canon path, we need to look at other sources, such as future Resident Evil games or supplementary sources like Capcom's archives books. This helps us narrow down some of the ambiguity, such as how we know that Chris, Barry, Jill and Rebecca all survived the events of Resident Evil, despite there not being an official version of that ending where this is depicted. Some plot points remain unclear even today. Does Nikolai survive the events of Resident Evil 3, for one example? We do not know. Although he is an author of a file in Resident Evil Survivor, the post-destruction entry is only written by him in the English version, not the Japanese version. And what is the correct canonical path in Resident Evil 2? Leon A, Claire B, or Claire A, or Leon B? For the record, the generally accepted version is the latter. However, future games show events that only happen in Leon A or Claire B, so even this isn't overly clear, as events from the opposing paths appear in additional storylines and official media. We also have the Outbreak Scenarios, which themselves can be a pickle to accurately date. Scenarios like the Hive must take place before the hospital is blown up in Resident Evil 3, and below freezing point must take place before Leon and Claire visit the location on the 29th of September 1998. However, generally speaking, there is a logical structure and timeline here, and while some events are not set in stone, the complete canon can be experienced if you were to play Chris's and Jill's game in Resident Evil 1, all 4 scenarios of Resident Evil 2, and going through the different life selections in Resident Evil 3, and of course playing the Outbreak Scenarios as well. How do the remakes of Resident Evil 2 and 3 come into this, and crucially, what is the status in terms of the canon when it comes to these games? The first obvious comparison would be to remind ourselves these games are not the first Resident Evil games to be remade. Indeed, the 1996 classic received the remake treatment back in 2002 with the critically acclaimed GameCube release. Still highly revered in many fans' eyes, the remake took nearly everything from the original game and improved it. The Spencer Mansion was beautifully realised and expanded upon. Remake brought into the canon officially the George Trevor letters, added new parts to the mansion and introduced us to Crimson Heads and Lisa Trevor as an undefeatable monstrosity. But it is the way that they did it which is important here. The remake was designed to be just that, a complete remake of the original game. Everything that was in the 1996 game was ported over, with the exception of one minor file, and then expanded upon. This was the complete Mansion incident experience and was quite clearly a remake of the first game, both graphically and from a lore perspective. Even games that specifically referenced the 1996 Resident Evil, such as Code Veronica in 2000 with the hidden Antarctic mansion, remain valid and accurate to the remake, and as such, Resident Evil on the GameCube was beloved by all for this retelling. It presented a quintessential survival horror experience, updating with modern graphics and adding to the storyline. Even though, from a narrative point of view, it relegated the 1996 game, it didn't feel abandoned or less loved than it was before. So, come the announcement in 2015 that Capcom were going to remake Resident Evil 2, surely fans will be equally delighted as they were with Resident Evil 1. Well, honestly, for many, no. And not because of the improvements that Capcom would go on to make, especially with the gameplay, but because of the lore consequences a remake would inevitably have. Unlike Resident Evil 1, where the mansion is only visited in that game, Resident Evil 2's locations are far more popular and used in other titles. The glorious RPD, for example, is visited not only in Resident Evil 2, but also in Resident Evil 3, and the Desperate Times scenario in Outbreak. Further, Birkin's underground laboratory is explored in the below freezing point scenario in Outbreak, and the surrounding marshalling yard being a focal point in both Resident Evil 0 and the canonical chapters in Resident Evil The Umbrella Chronicles. Concerns were also raised about fans about remaking 2 from the ground up, and how it would affect the geography of these Raccoon City locations and the canon of these overlaps. Resident Evil 2 is also a key game in terms of the storyline. The zapping system was well ahead of its time, and whilst there may not be one clear path in a complete playthrough, there were many story beats that would be used in future titles, such as Sherry's G-Virus infection and Ada's shady employment status. And let's not forget poor old Marvin. We see his demise in Outbreak, the barricading of the RPD, as told in Resident Evil 2 files before he falls unconscious but wakes up in time to help Claire. Unlike Resident Evil, therefore, this game has a lot of story fingers and a lot of story pies. Fast forward to January 2019 and Resident Evil 2 Remake was released to great fanfare, and what a remake it was. By all accounts, a superb survival horror experience and deserving of the Game of the Year nominations it subsequently received. So how did it fare with the lore fans' concerns? Regular listeners of the Resident Evil podcast will know this has been a constant source of discussion, as Capcom have never been overly clear with their game's canon status. But what is clear is that the remake, as good as it is a shortened experience of the previous game, a Cliff Note versions of the original title. The complex zapping system was gone, the A and B scenarios removed in favour of an identikit second scenario, albeit with a different end boss, and gone was the more intricate storytelling of the original version. Remake 2, however, did ensure that the key points were there: Sherry's infection, the mystery of Ada and her using Leon, Claire and Leon meeting, and ultimately escaping the city via train. And for most fans, this was fine. It retained the key points of what made the original game so beloved and improved on the graphics and controls, something most gamers felt was needed. But what about the geography? How did Remake 2 respect the overlapping interests of other canon entries? In a word, it did not. Not even close. The RPD was dramatically remade, and whilst it can be said with confidence that the essence of the old RPD was still present, huge changes were made, including new rooms and locations like bathrooms and armories. Some of these allowed changes for oversights that had little lore impact. Adding additional and realistic numbers of bathrooms to the RPD building clearly had no issues, but some of the other changes had larger impacts. The STARS office was almost unrecognisable, and the police station was littered with statues of unicorns and lions. The main hall was redesigned so that the main plot point of Desperate Times, escaping under the statue, could not make sense at all, as this is now the exit point for the remake itself. Changes were not limited to the RPD either. The adding of an orphanage was not in accordance with the previous canon's map, and the changes to the sewers placed them directly below and behind the RPD. But the real culprit here was the changes to the underground laboratory, now redubbed Nest. Not only did we see a change of name, but there was dramatic changes to the layout and location within Raccoon City. Previously, the laboratory was on the outskirts of Raccoon City, close to the foothills of the Arclay Mountains, but now we see basically the lab under the city centre, accessible pretty much from the RPD itself. The change was dramatic. Birkin's lab has been a critical location in Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil Outbreak, and Resident Evil 0. Gone was the rather dank, atmospheric underground facility in place for an extremely sterile, top-secret, illegal bioweapon laboratory that actively promotes visitors. Whilst the main plot points continue to exist in Nest, such as the creation of the G-Virus and even the overgrown plant, it does so in a contradictory manner in favour of realism. The ivy plants from the original Resident Evil 2 were replaced with a new plant zombie, and whilst an interesting change, the ivy BOW was created in this lab based on the Plant 42 combat data from the Mansion incident. Therefore, if Remake 2 is the new timeline, this contradicts the Ivy BOW that was subsequently seen on Sheena Island in Resident Evil Survivor, and more damning the Ivy XY BOW from Resident Evil The Dark Side Chronicles, which explored the idea of adding human DNA to the plant BOW. Quite why they would need to do that, in light of the plant zombies in Resident Evil 2, is anyone's guess. Perhaps more importantly, from a geographic perspective, there is simply no way that Nest and the original Birkin's lab can coexist within the same universe unless there are two separate labs under the city operated by a certain William Birkin. So come the release of the game, fans groups were alight with how this could possibly work within the canon. The game itself, however, really did present an answer that was in effect confirmed by Capcom themselves. Such was the Cliff Notes version of Remake 2. The intention appeared to be that Capcom wanted to create more of a reimagining as opposed to an actual remake. The game may have been missing a lot of the specific lore the original game had, but it looked like that was the intent. Indeed, following release, the developers of the game all sat round a dinner table and spoke about their game. Here, it was revealed that an actual remake was originally conceived, but scrapped in favour of this reimagining.
なんとなく俺も開発チーム見てて、本当にスタートした頃って、なるべく変えないようにっていうのを一番吹っ切れたのどこですか？変えてもいいやん。それ興味深いですね。いや、まさに竹内さんがもう本当にバイオ2やりたい人は原作やればいいんだって言ってくれた時ですけど。俺的にはだからそれがなんかこう、なんていうの原作へのリスペクトで2があるんだからそれはもう完成してるもんだからこれでいいじゃん。カグイとアンボと俺らで作るものはこれじゃなくて俺らのバイオ2を新しく作るっていう発想でこう。
Later, Capcom released a podcast where the canon was discussed. It was confirmed that the original game and thus the storyline took precedent over the reimagining.
Yeah, I think just to satisfy their answers, it hasn't rewritten the continuity of the RE franchise, even though there are differences between this and the original RE2.
That's a good question.
It's because all the REs right now are based on the history we had from the original game. So this is more like a revisiting of it.
Reimagining.
Yeah.
With this clarification, more calm descended upon the lore-focused community, as Remake 2 had found its place. The original game was still the canon piece of gaming, the remake an excellent up-to-date survival horror experience for fans to enjoy, a luxury product, so to speak. Following this clarification, such is the inquisitive nature of the fandom, other questions were then raised by fans, because not only did Remake 2 change a few things, they also added new elements that could, in theory, add to the existing canon. Raccoon City Jazz Festival, for example, but perhaps more pertinently, Dr. Wayne Lee, a key umbrella scientist from Birkin's lab, of whom you, as a player, acquire his wristband. Was Wayne Lee canon? Arguably, could new tidbits of information that didn't necessarily contradict the timeline be included in a hypothetical timeline? Could the new files be considered canon? Did we as fans have the right to consider these things? Fans took slightly different views, but for many, the definitive statement from Capcom in their podcast was a sure sign that anything from Remake 2 was, for the most part, non-canon, existing in its own reimagined universe. And that was the state of the world from 2019 onwards. That was before Remake 3. Prior to the release of Remake 3, many expected the game to follow the same formula that had been so successful for Remake 2 just a year before. And to a certain extent they were right. We did indeed receive a reimagined version of the classic title featuring Jill Valentine escaping the city and being relentlessly pursued by the nemesis BOW. But unlike Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 3 features significantly more locations, meaning a number of key factors needed to be hit to correlate well. The original Resident Evil 2, although longer, only really featured the RPD, sewers and labs. The original Resident Evil 3 mixes this up with smaller localities within larger hub areas. Uptown and downtown were littered with famous smaller locations like Barjack, the RPD, press office and the pharmacy. We also had stints in Raccoon City Hospital, with the potential of another conflict with Resident Evil Outbreak, all before the city is bombed on the 1st of October 1998. We need not review Resident Evil 3, but it is well known that a lot of the above was cut. No press office, no park, the Dead Factory was replaced with Nest 2, and the origins of the Hunter Gamma, previously an Umbrella Europe creation, was dramatically altered to suggest it was grown in Raccoon and set loose in the sewers before the Mansion Incident T-Virus leak in May 1998. We saw an expanded role for UBCS member Tyrell, who was no longer an Umbrella monitor, and Nikolai was now seemingly a double agent working for a rival organisation. Now all this would have been fine if the existing reimagined mantra as per Capcom was applied. However, most of us at the Resident Evil podcast, when playing the game, all felt the same thing. Unlike Remake 2, Remake 3 was making a concerted effort to add lore to this game, whether that be with extremely detailed files, but also cutaways with specific times and dates placing Jill's progress almost precisely, something that was even absent in the 1999 game. Despite the significant changes, it felt more of an intentional remake as opposed to a reimagining. The new detail was concerning, for these thoughts were only exacerbated with comments made from Capcom producer Peter Fabiano. In an interview with the fan website Resident Evil Database, he was asked specifically about the canon for both Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3. His response? Both games exist in the same universe. Since this, he has continued to hold this statement on Twitter also. Cue pandemonium in the community. How could this possibly be? What has caused this change? What's the canon now? Alternative timeline? Is it possible to sync the remakes and the originals? And all this leads on to the question in the title of this video: is Nathaniel Bard therefore canon? In truth, we do not know. The state of the canon is very much in flux at the moment, and without meaning any disrespect to Peter Fabiano, his comments, especially in relation to Remake 3, cannot possibly be accurate given the content shown in the game itself against the other original titles, including the original Resident Evil 3 itself. You could, if you really wanted to, give Remake 2 a pass. It is so vague on so many points, in theory, that could exist if you ignored the obvious geographical inconsistencies. It still raised questions as to whether Wayne Lee would ever be mentioned again, of course. But Remake 3 is so different. It is so detailed with times, place, location, and inevitably raises hundreds of questions about the canon. If both the original games and the remakes exist in the same canon, you could ask such questions as: who killed Brad Vickers? Nemesis or zombies? Where did Jill fight the final Nemesis form? The Dead Factory or Nest 2? Did Jill even visit the park and Dead Factory when she was seemingly in Nest 2 at the same time? Did the hospital blow up in Raccoon City? Is the Spencer Memorial Hospital even the same hospital from the original game? Did Jill visit the RPD at all whilst in Raccoon City? Where did Jill rest after infection? The altar at St Michael's Clock Tower or the hospital? Did Jill travel in the city via a tram or a subway? Does the tramway even exist in the new Raccoon City, even though it is shown in Outbreak? Was Jill rescued by Barry? Was Tyrell a monitor? Was Nikolai double-crossing Umbrella? These are just a handful of possible contradictory questions that are raised if we are to take Fabiano's comments at face value, and you can see that it simply cannot work. Adding to it are the issues with Remake 2, such as Birkin's lab geography, and the entire Raccoon City incident is now somewhat of a convoluted mess as to exactly what happened during late September 1998. There is no doubt in our mind that urgent clarification is needed, because if Fabiano's understanding is endorsed by Capcom, then from a factual point of view, only the parts of the originals and remakes that align can work. It would mean, from a timeline perspective, the only thing truly canon from Remake 3 would be that Jill attempts her last escape from Raccoon City, she is pursued by a creature called Nemesis, true appearance and shapes unknown, Brad is killed by something, she teams up with Carlos, Jill is infected, resting place unknown, a vaccine is created, Jill destroys Nemesis somewhere, Jill and Carlos escape the city as it is blown up. Now this certainly hits all the key story beats, and leads nicely into Resident Evil 5 with Jill's infection, but the loss of so much lore is crippling. To have Jill's entire storyline over 4 days summarised as being the only possible depiction of events is soul-destroying for fans who have, in many cases, enjoyed the minutiae of the storyline more so than the actual gameplay they are in. Quite simply, to reduce 20 years of story to a few sentences cannot be right. So what are the alternatives here? Well, there are 2 options. Firstly, to reconfirm the status of these games as being reimaginings. We thought we knew the position beforehand, but this has been thrown into doubt with the recent comments. Reconfirm that the original games take precedence, then parity is restored. We can enjoy these games for what they are, so-called luxury retellings with modern gameplay. Secondly, and the one that we at the podcast sadly expect to be the case moving forward, to confirm that the remakes are now the new canon. Such were the precise details included in Remake 3, it seems inevitable. Further, the numerous nods to the Outbreak series, whether it be Rita Phillips, the Kite Brothers Railway, Al Lester of all things, could this be a way of trying to appease the growing calls for the Outbreak games to be remade? Remake 3 also seemingly has a nod to Resident Evil Survivor, with the tyrants being created in Nest 2, again perhaps trying to incorporate that game's key lore point into the remake. And why would they do this? Simple. If the Outbreaks and the Survivor, as well as the original games, are removed from the canon, and probably by extension Resident Evil Dead Aim as well, there is an opportunity that come Resident Evil 8, Capcom can categorically market to the gaming world that if you want to play the entire Resident Evil canonical saga, then this can be done on one console, and all up to date looking modern too. Not many franchises can do that, but that would be the reality. On either PlayStation 4 or Xbox One, a player can pick up Resident Evil 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, Revelations 1 and 2, and via download in HD, Resident Evil Code Veronica. And if you are feeling really brave, Umbrella Corps could also be counted on that PlayStation 4, although it's likely this too will be scrapped from the canon. No tears will be shed for that particular entry. However, removing the original Resident Evil 2 and 3 in favour of these remakes would be heartbreaking for so many. Yes, they may have dated visually, a problem mostly overcome by the seamless HD projects we would add, but from a storyline perspective, the remakes do not come close. So much is lost in the remakes, even though combined, they more or less tell the main points of the Raccoon City incident. The loss of the Outbreak lore would also be a big deal. Even Resident Evil Survivor, a game not exactly loved by the fans, really expands upon the insidious activities of Umbrella, and deleting these entries, whilst less of a loss, would reduce the wider narrative of the franchise. Resident Evil Dead Aim would be in a similar boat, pardon the pun, should it no longer be considered also. This is not an ideal solution, but perhaps there is an inevitability to it. All franchises at some point get a reboot. Resident Evil has had lots of gameplay reboots over the years, a factor that's kept the series going strong. Perhaps it was only a matter of time before we saw a cataclysmic storyline jolt as we head towards the next generation of gaming machines. We at the podcast, however, still hope the first option continues to keep the original Resident Evil 2 and 3 narratively the most important. It would certainly be a shame to see all the extra characters, scenarios and situations they provide to vanish. Thanks for joining us on this trip into the lore of the franchise. Don't forget we have over 8 years and 60 podcasts covering Resident Evil that's available on this channel or via all good podcast apps. Subscribe to either to not miss out when a new podcast drops, and please follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Many thanks for watching.